Yeah, here I'm sharing with you the text. As you can see, Henry James as our example of really, in a way, very strong example of 19th century, early 20th century great American novelist in every perspective. He is completely, powerful in terms of the style, technique, all the technicalities about the modern novel in every sense. Not exactly, like to the extreme sense in the modernist example, no, but it's a bit mixture, or maybe as a very good example of the link or the bridge between modernism and realism, or literary realism and modernism in every sense. But he was seen as the master, completely the master of fiction, the master of the novel in the Western English tradition. Now, Henry James wrote a lot of stuff, really, a lot of novels and stories, short stories and novels, and philosophy, and a lot of things really to do with, really life as a whole, if I can put it like that. So as you can see here, our example, here we're talking about questions to do with American reality, American realism, early American modernism as well, because later on we shall see more examples of modernism in poetry. But today, as you can see, I think we will be giving at least 2-3 lectures on him. And here we have really a nice short novel as an example. And the example here is Daisy Miller as an example, which is completely typical example of James's writings about Americans in Europe or Americans abroad, because this is, I think, one of his big questions. Always talked about the positions and the situations around American people abroad, and the effects and the comparison and contrasts of that thing. Let me see, people sending. Oh, somebody asking, yeah, when will we have the test? Well, according to our plan, I think is week 12 really is our test. Let me double check this. Just let me double check it, because if just a second. Because I want to see the exact. Yeah, really. After we finish, maybe if I finish Henry James, I gave 2 weeks for James. Yeah, maybe at the end, the last lecture of week 11. The last lecture, or Wednesday next week. Yeah, this week, week 10, next week, week 11. Yeah, Wednesday next week. Wednesday next week, I will mention that again to you. Okay, because somebody.
Next week is holiday, doctor.
Oh, really?
Yes, National Day holiday.
Oh, all of the week? I really forgot. I see. So how many days? Holidays?
It will be on Wednesday and Thursday.
Oh, Wednesday, Thursday. Well, that means, yeah, that means definitely Monday, week 12. Yeah, Monday, week 12. Okay, so yeah, I forgot about that. Mm. Mm. Okay. Now to go back to the text, because to go back to James here, I share with you. You see it, of course. The first here we have. I gave you a little introduction about biographical information about James. Just really highlighted as I did here. Now, most of his novels really deal with this question as the connection, or I say the social and material interplay between exile Americans, English people, and continental Europeans. Really, this is his main big theme. He was always drawing on this idea because he himself really did that, because he himself spent all his life outside America. And he spent, he stayed in London most of his life, really. And he settled in London for a long time. And in fact, only the last year of his life, he became a British citizen. He switched from being American into being English only on the last year, which is really funny in a way. I don't know why he did that, but this is it. So he wrote, as you can see, I gave examples: The Portrait of a Lady, The Ambassadors, The Wings of the Dove, and all this. These are the big names. They were dealing with this question of Americans, exile Americans, and the contrast to, English people, or the comparison and contrast between Americans and English, and or, if you like, other Europeans in all of that. Like as I say here, the examples like The Portrait of the Lady did that, The Ambassadors did that, The Wings of the Dove did that, and they were really extremely important novels at that time. His novels mostly also were seen as being experimental. Like here, I say, describing the internal states of mind, the social dynamics of his characters. And he was, in a way, showing this style in a very sort of, could be sometimes contradictory, could be ambiguous in the ways he was doing this, and sometimes could be like really impressionistic, which is really ambiguous. Really, and that's why I'm saying here at the end, I say like impressionist, really like impressionist paintings, if you like. Some of his fiction, as I said, was a bit because, as I say, he was dealing with these heavy questions at the early 20th century and the interests in Gothic. Late 19th century, early 20th century, the interests in Gothic and in horror fiction. He did that, I think, in a very nice story, or a very nice novella, really. It's called The Turn of the Screw. Really, he became very famous because of this, again, as a very good example of this, what we call ghost story. As I said, really, many writers before him, and I think the example we can say is the example we have seen by many of his American counterparts, mainly the figures we have mentioned, really the master of that was Edgar Allan Poe. So he did this you know, in this example called The Turn of the Screw. Very really strong and dramatic in that way. I'm not really keen about explaining or talking about it now. Just you know, I'm showing you here really examples or little points about his achievements. When he stayed in Europe, he met many great names and many great people, you know, masters of fiction in Europe. And I mentioned here many of the big names like Russians, like Pushkin, or sorry, Ruskin, sorry, not Russian. Ruskin as a great name. Of course, later on he met other names like you know, Russian writers. He did, but here I'm saying he met names like Dickens, Arnold, William Morris, George Eliot, and so on. And he was even, as I said, in Europe, everywhere in Europe, till finally he settled in England, in London. But there, what he said, you know, talking about Rome or really Europe itself, he said, "At last, for the first time, I live." You know, this is really his sentence to his brother, saying now, you know, being in Rome, for example, he called it the eternal city, you know, which is really a very interesting example to say about that. Most of his fiction, as you can see here again, was published originally in serial installments, like mostly serialized fiction in 19th century. Most of the 19th century novels were published in serials or in sections or portions in magazines and newspapers, and later on were published as novels. So because of this serialization, he was typically writing like any Victorian novel, really for middle-class people, mainly middle-class society, mainly rich society, really. And here I say mainly also, we can say middle-class women, which is again typical of that. And here I mention examples again, notice people, you know, novels like especially, as I said, you know, when he was living mostly in France and in Italy, and he met these people here. Daisy Miller, you know, again, I say at this period here of time, you can see he wrote again the Americans, the Europeans, again, you know, examples like other books on criticism and philosophy, like, for example, French poets and novelists like Hawthorne, a book on Hawthorne, and so on. So really, you know, he wrote a lot. Now, in 1878, Daisy Miller established his fame on both sides of the Atlantic. It drew again on this question about a woman whose behavior is outside the social norms of Europe. Really, he's giving this example, the one we have. You may say this is a novel or a small novel on, as an example, of a woman who was behaving, you know, in a way, according to American standards, she was behaving strangely, or maybe strangely, maybe we say here outside the American, even outside the social norms of Europe. Even to Europeans, she was a bit strange, the way she was moving and behaving, etc., etc. People thought that she was maybe too advanced or too, maybe too, if you like, too much maybe freedom in her behavior. Anyway, we shall see, and that's why we shall see in the novel, you know, really Daisy suffered a lot because of this, and she died sadly miserably died as a consequence of that, or if you like, she was killed by the writer to say that she was too much maybe out of time or maybe before her time, and so on. So really, this is a brief summary, if you like, or maybe one sentence about this novel is about a woman who was behaving somehow differently from what society would have expected, or society would have accepted, not expected, but accepted, because she was behaving like this. She was an American girl in Europe, in Geneva, in Europe, or in, let's say just in Switzerland, in the middle of Europe, to say this is a Swiss society, or an example of European society, civilized, maybe reserved, maybe conservative society in Europe. And that's why maybe it was a bit her behavior, a bit strange or a bit shocking to society. But to her, she was typically American girl, and thinking and behaving the way she was brought up, and she doesn't mind, and she was open and free and so on. So so this is really the idea here I'm saying briefly, but of course later on I'm going to give more details about that. Again, his masterpiece, really, to many people, The Portrait of a Lady. Again, this is a very typical example of his novels. The Portrait of a Lady is his really first, I think, we say his first, but because many people think that he wrote other masterpieces. Maybe you don't agree to the word masterpiece, but this is it, Again, the novel called The Bostonian, from Boston, or again, another short novel called The Tragic Muse, and I mention here really more, if you like, titles which I mentioned earlier briefly. So just look at them. Now here I move to briefly to talk about his style. Again, I copied some of this, or I summarized some of this from many references in the net. I just did it for your sake to just have a look. Really, most of his novels, I say, contrast, I say juxtapose characters from the old world, which is Europe, embodying a feudal civilization that's beautiful, often corrupt and alluring, and the new world, which is the United States. Here, of course, according to Americans, the old world is Europe, and the new world is America. Again, here to say how, Americans, whose people sometimes are called brash or open or assertive, or embodying the virtues of the new American society. Particularly here we say about the personal freedom and the more highly evolved moral character. That's why, how Daisy was seen as very open and very free and so on. And this is what I say here, the clash. This clash of personalities and cultures in stories of personal relationships in which power is often well exercised. Again, here his characters or his protagonists are often young American, innocent or even naive women facing oppression or abuse or, maybe mistreatment. Women who are often tormented, women, and that's why later on we shall see here really the tragedy. This girl here really suffered because of her openness. And sadly, she caught the disease and she died. It's an indirect torment, if you like, or shown as perpetually victimized and thrust into the claws of other evil men. Maybe you may agree to this, but many people, you know, in all of his novels, he showed this. In a way, James was writing as a typical Victorian writer, really, to talk about, you know, I'm saying typical Victorian writer, talking about the domination and the strength of the male, the masculine figure, and how the female, to some extent, or the woman, had to face problems and difficulties and so on. So that's why here I'm saying here, you can see here the male wickedness. You know, this is typical Victorian attitude, male wickedness. Notice the present and reiterated and passionate plea for the fullest freedom for those innocent women who are often imperiled by their reckless and often cruel folly, you know, because they are shown as being weak women, or being, you know, maybe not really aware of things, and that's why maybe they could be seen naive, they could be stupid, you know, you say folly, or even cruel folly, as being, you know, very innocent. You know, again, this is maybe a negative image of women who are simple and naive. Maybe many of us today would reject this view, but this is the idea. I'm saying this is typical Victorian attitude, being the man, the strong, in the strong position, and women to be in the weak position. And here he showed this. This is related to his main theme of his position as an expatriate, or as an outsider, or somebody who was living in Europe. You know, he himself, meaning James himself, being an expatriate, or being someone who is an outsider, American living in Europe. Yeah, so he's showing this to see how his own women are being very innocent, and they come to Europe maybe, and they are treated in a very bad way by men and so on. So again, here we know that he originally came from a rich middle class and provincial family, or what the Europeans would call polite society, and he tried to analyze all levels of society, you know, ranging from working class to aristocracy. Yeah, so again, here we come back to the same idea, which is very Victorian. You know, this question of the class, the clashes between the poor and the rich, and so on. So this is again absolutely typical question of Victorian time, and this is again to talk about, you know, the question of the bourgeois and the bourgeoisie, and the poor and the you know, the working class, and so on. This is absolutely typical Victorian 19th century Victorian issue, which is the clashes between classes. And he showed that most of his characters, you know, he showed this in all of his novels, and all his characters as being very aristocratic, some of them in that sense. So the efforts of middle-class Americans making their way up in European capitals, you know, showing this, how, you know, rich Americans growing into being rich in Europe. And, you know, here I conclude this question about notice. Generally, he was trying to capture what is called later the often prevailing standards of the Victorian era of Anglo-American culture, as shrouded as ever with complications of suspicions, psychological really experimentations. Really, I wanted to say psychoanalytical, you know, overtones. Again, so psychological experimentation. Again, I say insidiousness. Again, betrayal. Again, racism, and so on. So you can see here so many issues, so many social issues, you know, ranging from racism, you know, again, really to I don't know, betrayal, I say, and psychoanalysis, all these questions. You can see all these heavy, sometimes ambiguous, tough questions about society in general. James was known, if you like, as I see here, I say, in a very Victorian-like atmosphere. You see, this is again, I repeat that, very Victorian-like atmosphere. The simple and the direct style, again, like in Victorian novels, absolutely like in a realistic, absolutely realistic fashion. But later on, of course, he changed. I mean, this is his early, I say, please read all this because I can't read it all. But this is the idea, because his production, his writings were characterized by all these things. Again, his style later on became complicated. And I think, sometimes I think he wrote in huge, I don't know, sometimes I find his style is very complicated and I don't like him because of this intentionally difficult language, intentionally difficult style, very long sentences, very, very long sentences with so many clauses and so many, run-on sentences, which is sometimes really nagging and not easy to follow. And I will show you the example later about that. Notice here, the frequent double negatives, for example, use this. They frequently uses double negatives and the complex descriptive imagery. Like for example, single paragraphs begun to run for pages. Yani, come on, one paragraph, pages and pages as one paragraph. And sometimes, as I say, very, very long sentences, which is really annoying. To me, I think it's annoying, and you have to really stay wide awake to see what's going on. Notice here, running page after page, in which an initial noun would be succeeded by pronouns surrounded by clouds of adjectives, right? And prepositional clauses, far from the original reference. And verbs would be deferred and then deferred and preceded by a series of adverbs. Now, really, this is not my sentence. I took all this from other sources. And I think this is true, absolutely true, because when you read his novels and his criticism, you really, sometimes you get headaches about how to follow exactly what's going on. Now, in a way, he wanted to do this as he wants his readers to be really absolutely, aware, or he wants his readers to be very sensitive observers and to read his style. Again, as I said, he did this maybe because, as I say, he changed his simple Victorian style into the modernist style. Many people thought he did this because he wants to show his complication. And again, James's consciousness of the modernist complicated style, which is, again, I say, self-conscious, which was also, again, I say, very self-conscious. And I think this is part of the modernist technique, which later on developed, we don't talk about it here much, but in the 20th century, early 20th century, it's called really here, I say, the developments of the 20th century modernist stream of consciousness. Fiction, as predicted by novelists as Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, the English woman, and James Joyce, the Irishman. They were the masters of this crazy thing, which is called the stream of consciousness. Okay, and James did that, in his really novels. I mention more and more about that. I think it's enough. Now, Daisy Miller here, I give you a brief note about Daisy Miller, about the story itself, a brief note before I start reading. As you can see here, it's published 1879. Really, 1879 is a typical, absolutely typical Victorian story, typical Victorian novel, no doubt, no doubt. Very Victorian in every sense, the topic, everything. Let me just so Daisy Miller, as you can see here, I give a brief, again, a brief summary of the story. Talks about, notice here, this courtship or this love relationship between the beautiful American girl, Daisy Miller, by Frederick Winterbourne. This is, again, as you can see here, two Americans met in Europe. Two Americans met in Europe. And this love relationship between them, she's a nice, beautiful American girl called Daisy Miller, and the American man called Frederick Winterbourne, a sophisticated American man, an expatriate living in Geneva, Switzerland, and the moment vacationing and, of course, like Daisy, experiencing Europe. So we can see here that both of them, as if to say, both of them are in Europe as visitors, as learning, as experiencing life, as, you know, enjoying the sophistication of Europe or whatever, and learning from reality. And that's why I say here, experiencing. So they met here, as I say, at a hotel in a resort town of Vevey, Switzerland. A young Winterbourne meets a rich, pretty girl named Daisy Miller, who is traveling around Europe with her mother and her young brother, Randolph. So Daisy this is typical, you know, American family, you know, very small family, a mother and her two children, one girl and one boy. The boy, a younger brother called Randolph. And Winterbourne, you know, met them there, who has lived in Geneva most of his life, is both charmed and mystified by Daisy. So when he met her, he was really charmed, and again, you say mystified, you know, because he was really amazed by her behavior. Because remember, here we say the starting of her behavior in Europe, you know, by an American girl, the way she's behaving, as we shall see. And by the way, her behavior was absolutely normal and natural, and nothing wrong with her. Absolutely nothing wrong with her. But you see, according to masculine American mentality, or I should say, American Victorian American masculine, you know, mentality, she was maybe strange. Not just mentality, but discourse, because here we find, ironically speaking, the way she's described as being improper is by his own aunt, by a woman. You know, other women, you know, describe her as being improper, and we shall see this in the story. So, who is less proper than the European girls he has met? She seems ideally spontaneous. You know, what's wrong with that? You know, when you are spontaneous, you are natural. You behave naturally. I think this is the best. I think this is good, you know, to behave naturally, not to be false. You know, again, we say, if a little tactless and uncultivated, maybe she's not false. She's natural. And I think this is good. And here we see, despite the fact that Mrs. Costello, his aunt, strongly disapproves of the Millers and flatly refuses to be introduced to Daisy. Winterbourne spends time with Daisy at Vevey, which is the place called Vevey, and even accompanies her unchaperoned to Chelon Castle, a famous local tourist attraction. You see, here we see that Winterbourne really liked her, and he spoke to her, and he really loved her. But his aunt, Mrs. Costello, again, here we see the name, again, his aunt, the woman here, we see her, she's very, very sort of arrogant woman who does not want to see Daisy because she thinks Daisy is, lower than her, in society. And that's why she really strongly disapproves of him meeting her. Even she does not want to see her. Even she does not want to see her mother or her, brother or anybody. She just like this, in a very funny, prejudiced manner. Very prejudiced manner, she say no, as if to say, and I think this is, one of the big issues in this novel, the prejudice which killed Daisy, the prejudice which killed Daisy in this story. The following winter, Winterbourne goes to Rome knowing Daisy will be there, and is deeply distressed to learn from his aunt that she has been, she has taken up with a number of well-known fortune hunters and become the talk of the town. Now here his aunt told him later on that Daisy is meeting other men and talking to other men and other suitors and so on. So that's why here the narrator or saying that, she's a careless girl and she has a bad reputation, talking to other suitors. And here the idea really saying that fortune hunters, because she could be a rich woman who's going to be followed by somebody who wants to marry her for her money. So particularly here, this man called Giovanni or Giovanelli, really, he's an Italian name man. She has one suitor in particular, a handsome Italian named Mr. Giovanelli, of uncertain background, whose conduct with Daisy mystifies Winterbourne, believing her as a flirt. Wow. So he thought that Giovanelli, or this man Giovanelli, the Italian man she met, everybody started talking about her and him, Daisy and Giovanelli. And, especially he got this idea from his aunt. He doesn't know really for sure, he doesn't see, but he was mistakenly led to believe that she has a funny relationship with this man. But Daisy was innocent. You see, this is the idea, because later on he discovered, when it's too late, when Daisy died, he said he discovered that Daisy was absolutely innocent. She was not, as what he heard, as being, a bad, well, not bad, I shouldn't say bad, because there was nothing bad about her. Because they say, even again, you say believing that she was a flirt. And again, we say people said that she was, scandalized the American community in Europe. Among those scandalized is Mrs. Walker, another American expatriate whose moral values have adapted to those Italian society. We have more examples to look down on her. Again, which is in a very funny, really crazy class sort of clash here between this another American woman called Mrs. Walker, who thinks that she's above society and who feels that Daisy gave them a bad name, gave Americans a bad name in Europe. Again, it really is one of those stigmas, one of those really terrible, if you like, stigmas against, again, I say stigmas or even stereotyping or even really prejudice absolutely prejudiced. You know, sometimes when they see or just bluntly see, or they think and they surmise and they assume, and they all this thing really is to do with, as I say, really the bad image that they have thought of, or they have surmised about her. Okay. So notice here the next, I say, just a second, let me see who's sending me this. Yeah. So notice in both Walker and Winterbourne attempt to warn Daisy about the effect of her behavior is having maybe on her reputation, but Daisy would not listen, because Daisy thinks that she is doing nothing wrong. As Daisy spends increasingly more time with Mr. Giovanelli, Winterbourne begins to have doubts about her character and how to interpret her behavior. Remember, Daisy wanted Winterbourne to really marry her, or to sort of commit himself to her completely, but Winterbourne was always hesitating and thinking, as typical Victorian man, who did not show really love to her. And because Daisy was very innocent and trying to learn and trying to mature, and meeting this man Giovanelli doesn't mean that she's completely, you know, a lost woman or lost girl, but she is maturing, and she is having sort of maybe extra sort of knowledge about life. It doesn't mean that she's you know, in any way behaving badly, but everybody else thought, everybody else assumed, they assumed that she was blah blah blah. Notice, sometimes Daisy tells them they are engaged, and other times she tells them they are not. You see, Daisy, you know, she was learning. She was immature, a little bit immature, to say to people she's engaged to Giovanelli, and later on she would say no, she is not engaged. And you know, this shows that she is immature a little bit. It shows that she is growing and she is maturing. Notice, one night on his way home from a dinner party, Winterbourne passes a place here, decides to look at it by moonlight, braving the bad night air that is known to cause Roman fever, which is malaria. He finds Daisy and Mr. Giovanelli there, and immediately comes to the conclusion that she is lacking in self-respect. Again, notice, comes to the conclusion. So he jumped to conclusion just by looking at her talking or walking or sitting or talking to him at this time, thinking that she is having, or she's behaving maybe as, you know, in a certain way, maybe not respectful, but that's not true. She was completely if you like, in this way, she was completely respectful, you know, in her manner or whatever. So she was not behaving in any bad way, you know, but he assumed, again, this is the idea. He, as everybody else, assumed or surmised and prejudged and concluded, if you like, that she's not. Winterbourne is still concerned for Daisy's health. However, as he rebukes Giovanelli and urges him to get her safely home. A few days later, Daisy becomes very ill and she dies soon after. Before dying, she gives her mother a message to pass on to Winterbourne that indicates that she cared what he thought about her. After all, at the time she does not understand it, but a year later, still thinking about Daisy, he tells his aunt that he made a great mistake and has lived in Europe too long. Well, he realized too late that he really loved her, he wanted her, he should have married her, blah, 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 blah. And he said he made a terrible mistake by believing, and that's what it means. The mistake, the great mistake, that he believed, you know, all this crazy normal or norms about what is correct and what is not, what is normal and what is not, what is respectful and what is not. He fought and he learned and he finally realized when it was too late. Too late. Daisy was dead. Nevertheless, he comes back to Geneva and to his former life. You know, again, this is irony, the twist. Irony to say, well, he stayed there as if to say he never learned. Really, this is the story briefly. And I think you can see it's very simple. It's really very simple. It's very simple. So this idea of regret, as you can see, is one of the big themes. I want you to read this. The novel is not in here, as you can see, it's not really very, very big. It's only less, even the novel is less than 40 pages, less than 40 pages. So please read all of it, because it's really lovely to see, you know, these ideas done by James. Here again, I say this novella, I say novella because really, yes, it's a brief novel, a short novel, is a brief psychological description of the mind of a young woman. You see, again here, the main theme here as Americans abroad. This is the big theme. And I think he did this in all his novels. Psychological description of the mind of a young woman and an analysis of the traditional views of a society where she is a clear outsider. Yeah, I think this is really the idea. It is a psychological description of her, the way she behaved in that strange society. She is a stranger in Europe, and the way she was judged and prejudged, you know, it was you know, wrong, if you like. So Henry James uses Daisy's story to discuss the differences between Europeans and Americans, and more generally the prejudices. You know, this is the idea I was saying, the prejudice. The prejudice is common in any culture. Daisy Miller is generally about the subject of Americans abroad, how they react and see the old world, Europe, and its culture. As an American, Daisy is the victim of a social commotion. Social commotion, really, that she cannot see or understand. As if to say, maybe she is a victim of something. You know, here social commotion. You know, commotion means, you know, a lot of carry on. But you see, she can't see this carry on. She can't see all this problem which is talked about her. She can't understand it. Really, she can't understand it because she doesn't see it. To elaborate this theme of innocence embodied by Daisy, James uses symbolical names like the word Daisy. Even her name, Daisy, really means a flower which is full, which is, notice, a flower in full bloom without inhibitions. Again, and in the springtime of her life, you know, she's still young. Daisy contrasts sharply with Winterbourne. Again, notice his name, Winter and Bourne. She is springtime, he is winter, dead. Flowers die in winter, and this is precisely what happens to Daisy after catching the Roman fever. You see, she died as a result of catching that Roman fever, you know, which was at that time called consumption. Is this man himself symbolizing death? Maybe. Is this man himself symbolizing death in winter and then causing her to be reborn anew? I don't know. We have to wait. We have to wait and see in the afterlife if she comes back. You know, this is again, I think, the crazy question, which is, you know, maybe the possible question. To capture this psychological reality, Daisy catches the very real Roman fever, the malaria that was endemic to many Roman neighborhoods in the 19th century, and through which she dies. Ultimately, James was rather ambivalent towards the American character. And I think this is a good word here, ambivalent. I really must highlight it here for you. He was ambivalent, you know, not sure, yes and no, yes and no, no and yes, yes and no. You know, he was hesitating what to say about that. He was ambivalent about what is the American character. At one time, he was more sympathetic with the European way of life, with its emphasis on culture, education, and the art of conversation, etc., etc. And then later he changes his mind, you know? Again, and more, he saw his compatriots as boorish, as undereducated, or as absurd, provincial, or as unaware of vast and centuries-old world outside their own culture. You see, this is the idea of ambivalence about his own, how he sees his own people. He was really fascinated by this emotional innocence of the American national character. In a way, he was saying that Americans are really very innocent and straightforward and open and blah, blah, blah. I don't know, really. I don't know. Today, when you look at real life in American society, or even in any society, sometimes you really wonder what's going on. You really wonder what's going on. So, fascinated by the emotional innocence of American national character. However, he was also fascinated, with its emphasis on earnestness rather than artifice. You know, in many ways, he saw his own people, or American people, as artlessness, as cynics, maybe decadent and hypocritical. Yes. Yes. Cynics, artlessness, cynics, yeah, and decadent, yeah, and hypocrites. So this is really the question here. I want you to pay attention to when you read this novel. Daisy Miller also is about this question of sadness and regret. Really, yeah, because Winterbourne spent his life regretting not marrying her. Daisy Miller is generally about the subject of sadness and regret, about things undone, and the wish to have done them. Both Daisy and Winterbourne regretted having not taken the opportunity and married each other when they had the time. They lived a life of abstraction and the ideal, and they could not figure out a way to achieve what they really internally wanted or wished. They waited and waited and waited and wasted their life without fully arriving at the realization that they should marry each other. In a way, the novella is about Winterbourne's innate innate, inhibited character, his inaction and fear or lack of passion that causes him to hide from life behind the ultimately unimportant puzzle of Daisy's innocence or naive character, which led her to death, or which led to her death. Okay? I think this is the whole thing about the story. Briefly, again, look at this first sentence. I told you this is from the introduction by James himself. Look at this first sentence here by our friend. Look at this first sentence by our friend James. I want to highlight it for you. You know, all this is one sentence. All this, one sentence. And you say, come on, why do you say that? It was in Rome. This is his introduction. This is not fiction. This is his writing, giving introduction about this novel. And this is his style, which sometimes I told you he's a bit, complicated. It was in Rome during the autumn of 1877, semicolon. Semicolon? Why semicolon? I would never use a semicolon here. It was in Rome during the autumn of 1877. Why semicolon? I think this is wrong. It should be a comma. A friend, when you put a semicolon here, you mean as if this is a separate sentence. It was in Rome during the autumn of 1877, semicolon. A friend then living there, but settled now in a south less weighted with appeals and memories, happened to mention dash, which she might perfectly not have done dash. Some simple and uninformed American lady of the previous winter, comma, whose young daughter, comma, a child of nature and of freedom, comma, accompanying her from hotel to hotel, comma, had. Oh, now we have the verb. Had picked up. Where is the subject? Where is the subject? A friend. Is it? A friend. Maybe this is the subject. Yeah, you see, this is the idea. Had picked up by the wayside. Another comma. With the best conscience of the world, comma, a good-looking Roman, comma, of vague identity, comma, astonished by his luck, comma, yet, so far as he might be, comma, by the pair, again you can see, brackets, all innocently, comma, all serenely exhibited and induced, colon, this at least, till the occurrence of some small social check, comma, some interrupting incident, comma, of no great gravity or dignity, comma, and which I forget, full stop. Huh? Can you study this stylistically as a style? What is that? Are you following, girls and boys?
Yes,
Really, this is what I meant by his very complicated style and giving you, a lot of commas and a lot of, all kinds of punctuations and all this carry on. This can be done easily in writing it in shorter, smaller at least. You can cut this into 3 sentences at least, or maybe 4 sentences. Why do you do this? You know, yeah, but this is his style. He did this deliberately. And I'm not saying this is wrong. You know, it's not wrong. It's not wrong style. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, but I wouldn't put, for example, I would never use a semicolon here. And I think this first semicolon is wrong here. But you can't say this to Henry James. You know, he's Henry James, you know? You know, this is the idea about, this is the introduction about this story. And he was saying here in this idea that the way he wrote this story in showing and in dramatizing. And that's why here I underline the word dramatize, meaning he was talking as if to say, or writing, saying that he wants to write fiction in a way, in a sort of dramatic fashion, not in the old fashion. He wants to dramatize, you know, meaning to show how characters interact, more likely interact like in a play. And this is to show rather than to narrate, to show rather than to narrate. And I think he did this in some way nicely in this novel. Now, read that. I really don't want to spend time reading it for you. You can read it. And this is here the beginning of the novel, how we start here, first section, Daisy Miller, a study. Again, notice why study? You know, this is the title, a study. Study of what? You know, this is to do with what I have said, or with all what these people said. This is a psychological study of this mentality of this girl, American girl. It's a psychological analysis of this girl, studying her and maybe understanding her. And when it was too late, they understood her when it was too late, after she died, you know? And of course, we know that she died, as we know, sadly, because of this terrible malaria, as I said, or maybe some kind of, you know, tuberculosis, if you like. I don't know. It's one of those diseases which were deadly at the time. So here the story begins, you know, again in a very nice way. By the narrator giving details about that, about the place, the locale, the hotel, and all this. Please, I'm not going to read everything here, but here we see the narrator telling us about how these people they met. Here he wanted to, you know, or the narrator is telling us, remember the story. The story, as you can see, is narrated by a third-person narrator, and sometimes you can see, as if to say, switch between first person and really third person. Like, for example, here when you know you could read the first section, as you can see, about Vevey, description of the city or the hotel and all this. Notice, I hardly know whether it was the analogies or the differences that were uttermost in the mind of young American, who 2 or 3 years ago sat in the garden of, looking about him rather idly at some. Notice here the narrator is saying I, you know, it's a narrator using I, using the first person narration, but who's observing. And as I said, really, James was excellent in using narrators. Really, he was very excellent in using the narrative voice here. It's a narrator observer, maybe first person narrator observer. Observer, could be innocent or not really participating in any way or judging in any way. But I think there are many judgments by the narrator about that. So that's why here he started talking about this American. It was a beautiful summer morning, and in whatever fashion the young American looked at things, they must have seemed to him charming. He had come from Geneva the day before by the little steamer to see his aunt, who was staying at the Hotel Geneva, having been for a long time his place of residence. Notice the narrator introducing to us, the main character, Winterbourne, and his aunt, and the way he came to see his aunt in Vevey, because he was living in Geneva. And as you can see, these places are in Switzerland. And to James, really, Switzerland was the best city, really. I mean Geneva, not just I said city. I should say really country as Switzerland. His aunt had, but his aunt had a headache. His aunt had almost always a headache, and she was not now. And she was now shut up in her room, smelling Carrefour, which is really funny here. She always has headaches because she thinks she's above all society. She's a very sort of rich, bourgeois lady, and who is always, who thinks that she's always, above everybody else. And when you say she's always having headaches, I think this is funny to say this. His aunt is always having headaches. Why? What's wrong with her? Again, that's the idea. Notice, he was at liberty to wander about. He was some 7 and 20 years of age. So he's really very, he's 27-year-old man. He's absolutely perfect young man. He's only 27. When his friends spoke of him, they usually said he was at Geneva studying. Well, studying what? Again, here really the idea related to the title of the story, study or a study. Was he studying people? Was he studying Daisy? What was he studying himself? Was he studying at university? Or was he whatever? So the word study and studying here really is interesting to see, the connotations and the meanings and all this. When his enemies spoke of him, they said, but after all, he had no enemies. Again, notice the narrator saying, oh, maybe he has no enemies. You see, he was extremely amiable and generally liked. So he's a nice boy. He was a nice gentleman, He was always amiable and lovable and kind man. What I should say is simply that he was, when certain persons spoke of him, they conveyed that the reason of his spending so much time at Geneva was that he was extremely devoted to a lady who lived there, a foreign lady, a person older than himself. So here the idea that this is the gossip again, that people say. So he was in Geneva, maybe he was in love with another lady whom we don't know. And even Daisy told him about this later. She will tell him, why are you coming back quickly to Geneva? Are you in love with another woman? Are you married to another woman? Do you have another relationship to another woman? And so on. And the narrator really didn't make it clear here, at least at this moment. And here the narrator is hinting that maybe he was devoted. A foreign lady, a person older than himself. Very few Americans, truly I think none, had ever seen this lady about whom there were some singular stories. Notice singular, and stories means really very strange stories. You see, again, stories. We don't know whether they were real. And I think this is the idea. Winterbourne really here, I think Winterbourne had an old attachment for the little capital of Calvinism. And I think here to do with his own, if you like, his own philosophy of life, and Calvin later on. Maybe I will pick up to this point later on with you next time, because now I think I will stop, because that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any question, you are welcome to ask.